The following is a Guadalupe Radio special presentation.
Today's talk I've entitled Going Medieval on the Common Good, Church and State Mixology. Yes, I am corny. Yes, I enjoy occasional puns. And no, I'm not paying royalties for the use of going medieval. As somebody who studies the Middle Ages, I can't tell you the number of times people make that joke to me. Oh, are you going to go medieval on this? It's like, well, you know, some of my forebears were in the Inquisition, so yeah, we can talk about this. Absolutely. Absolutely. So today I want to talk about stuff that is utterly uncontroversial, religion and politics. This is, right? This is my bread and butter. I am the walking nightmare for Miss Manners. I am the kind of person you can't talk to at Thanksgiving. There are entire New York Times thought pieces on how to deal with people like me at a Thanksgiving table. It's incredible. And yet we're going to brave it, we're going to do it, and it is being recorded, so may God have mercy on my soul. I did tell Father Golden, are you sure you want this recorded? We're talking about religion and politics. He said, yes, I have confidence in your discretion and good judgment. I said, well, open bar? Okay, let's keep them coming. I want to begin with a story for you. And it's a historical event. It took place, actually, in 1077 in the last week of January. So this was nearly 1,000 years ago, all right? The Holy Roman Emperor, another great man named Henry IV, was excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII in 1077. Now this was part of that big controversy which lasted for decades, called the investiture crisis. If you've ever heard of the investiture crisis, let me assure you, it can get just as tedious as you might imagine. It is about who has the authority to invest, that is, to pick and install bishops. So if you think internal church politics is boring, just add people wearing chainmail and swords, and it makes it a little more lively, okay? So this was an ongoing crisis about who has authority to appoint bishops and to invest them with the signs of office, to invest them in their seat. The Holy Roman Emperor claimed certain privileges that he and some of his other feudal lords would get to select the local church authorities. Makes sense, right? He's the emperor. He's the last word. He should get the power to do that. The Pope, not so much a fan of this. So the Pope does what good popes do. He excommunicates him. Now, when you are the emperor, being excommunicated is a little bit of a problem. You're being called the Holy Roman Emperor and you've just been excommunicated. What do? You have to get new business cards. It becomes very inconvenient. This excommunication was a real problem for old Henry, though, because it meant that functionally speaking, all the oaths of allegiance that had been sworn to him were suddenly dissolved. It sanctioned rebellion against him. So all of these different feuding kingdoms that were under his control, now were being told by the Pope, have at it, guys, go wild. This was a grave political problem for Henry because it seemed to threaten the very endurance of his dynasty. So, faced with this ultimatum, faced with this difficulty, the emperor had no choice, this is 1077, but to go to where the Pope was spending the winter, at this castle in Canossa. It is in Reggio Emilia. It has become a famous place, the walk to Canossa. Why is that? Because he arrives on the 25th of January and is refused entry in the middle of a blizzard. And so the emperor kneels, wearing a hair shirt, eating nothing, fasting, praying psalms of penance, praying prayers for mercy for 3 days in the snow outside of the door of the castle of Canossa. After 3 days, the Pope relents, lets him in, removes the excommunication, and they make up. He receives Holy Communion. It's all good. Imagine the world in which that happens. Now, don't think of your least favorite politicians and what that would look like right now. Because I'm telling you, having played that game already, it doesn't end in a good place. Barefoot, snow. Yes, there it is. But no, resist that temptation. Stay on the straight and narrow. Of course, if we were to delve into what happened afterwards, that is when a bunch of his vassals rebelled against Henry anyway, he crushed them violently, the Pope excommunicates him again, so he just invades Rome and sends him into exile. That complicates my narrative, so let's not deal with any of that, okay? Gregory was eventually canonized in 1584. They weren't too fond of that in Germany. And he is still known as one of the great exponents of this aggressive papal power, of this assertion of the church's freedom to appoint her own bishops, for it not just to be something that the state would do, it would be something that the church would do. This seems like a totally distant event, and yet, in point of fact, it remains at the heart of so much that troubles us in the West. Because we don't properly understand what happened during the Middle Ages, we are constantly getting the dynamic between church and state wrong. We're constantly missing the point about what so much of these controversies were, and about why the struggle for control wasn't so much about establishing a theocracy, but was much more about the church asserting her right to be herself, asserting her right to have her own bishops, to have her own internal life that wasn't just in control of a crowned head or the medieval equivalent of a bureaucrat. Now, this does not mean that it's a simple, one-sided narrative. Let me assure you, as I have, if you read some of these documents from the Middle Ages, it can take your breath away, the audacity of some of the claims that were made. There is not just a good guy and a bad guy in all of this. It was complicated, it was messy. And yet, because we've accepted a kind of one-sided narrative about what happened in the Middle Ages, we think, and we have a distorted image of why it's so important that the church fought the way she did. And we lose sight of the lessons that we need for today when the church faces new battles, different ones, and when going to Canossa is much less likely to happen. And therefore, we've got to brace ourselves for what might come. So, what am I going to talk about today? First, I want to talk about the relationship between church and state in the Middle Ages. Now, I study this stuff all day long. I can be pretty boring. I know this. I recognize this. Mea culpa. So instead of giving a scholarly or learned talk, like I should, I'm just going to give a kind of broad brushstrokes, one-sided portrait that suits my agenda, which is perfectly fine. You're going to laugh, you'll like it, I'll like it, we'll be happy. But I want to recognize at the outset that I could go into all sorts of more detail about this and that I'm oversimplifying. So granted, all right? Don't hold it against me, don't tell my professors, keep this tape to yourself. The second thing I want to talk about is an issue that's at the core of properly resolving these questions about church and state, and that is the common good. The common good. And we need to talk about that, and we need to understand it, because it leads to my third point. And we want to get to my third point, right? Because that means that I'll stop talking, the bar opens up again, people can move. Now, my third point is, what do we need to do now? How do we deal with some of the crises that are afflicting us now? And how do these lessons about the medieval experience and about the common good give us a path forward? Give us a way to be able to love our family, our community, our church, our country in the right way. Because it's not a zero-sum game. We need to be able to love all these things well, but in the right order and in the right way. So that's my agenda. At the end, I will rip off this microphone that's recording things for the fine people at Guadalupe Radio, and I will take off-the-record questions and we can go wild. Within reason. I don't have a PhD yet, and I would like to graduate. All right. Let's start with the liberty of the church, with the relationship between church and state. Now, I described this walk to Canossa, and that gave you a certain feel, right? This was a very Christian society. When we're talking about the Middle Ages, we're talking about a period of time that spanned over 1,000 years, depending upon how you measure it. We're talking about a period that goes from the end of the Roman Empire, a controversial sentence itself, because in certain ways it never really ended, but let's say the 4th or 5th century, all the way up through, well, when? The Renaissance, the Reformation, the French Revolution, you could make arguments for all of those. But let's say a little over 1,000 years, covering the whole territory of Western Europe, but also the Byzantine Empire, also North Africa until the Islamic conquest. You're talking about a huge scope, huge territory. And so what can we say? Well, the truth is, when we talk about the Middle Ages, you probably aren't imagining the peasants of Kiev and Rus. You probably aren't thinking about the Byzantine emperor and the relationship he had with the Patriarch of Constantinople. No, you are imagining a pastiche, an image that you have of what the Middle Ages was like. Probably dirty peasants, there's probably beautiful cathedrals, there might be knights in shining armor, probably jousting, because that's what they do. They joust all day long. But if you are a truly modern man or woman, your vision of the Middle Ages is one of quasi-theocracy. This is an age when religion went nuts. People kept trying to impose their faith on everybody. Wars of religion, the power of the church, the power of the spiritual over the temporal. This is the popular imagination that exists. The Middle Ages were a time in which religious leaders kept exercising their dominance over poor secular leaders who were just trying to do right for their country. So therefore, you have the invocation of figures like Emperor Henry IV. He became a hero in many ways to later German rulers. Bismarck in the 19th century said, no matter what happens, he said in the midst of the Kulturkampf, we will not walk to Canossa. Cue loud cheering in the Reichstag. Everybody knew that to revert to the Middle Ages, or to invoke the Middle Ages, was to invoke a time when the church had somehow gained far too much power, far too much influence, and it needed to be checked, it needed to be restrained. Poppycock. No. Now, yes, I realize I'm wearing medieval robes, which may give away that I'm not an entirely reliable reporter on this. I mean, wouldn't you like to have a good inquisition every now and then? Of course, we have our own versions of the Inquisition today, but don't get me started on that. I thought our Inquisition had a lot better procedures than the ones we have today. The truth is, though, that if we focus on the Middle Ages as a time when the church exercised just way too much power over the state, we're actually losing sight of what I suspect is a more important dynamic, which is that from the ancient world onwards, people thought about religion as functionally something that the state controlled. If you're living in ancient Rome, religion isn't something that's cordoned off into a separate part of your life. Religion is what it is to be Roman. Religion is intimately linked to politics, to the life of the state. The ancient Greeks, why did they kill Socrates? What was the reason they killed Socrates? The accusation was that he was an atheist. It was for a religious crime. The whole ancient world was one in which the idea of a church and state, let alone the fact that the church didn't exist yet, the idea of separating these two would be nonsensical. The whole idea of what religion is intimately tied up in your civic and national, if we can use that term, identity. It's all wrapped up in who you are as a Roman, as a Greek, as an Egyptian. Religion is just part of being a citizen of somewhere. Christianity challenges this in all sorts of weird and surprising ways. We have a Lord who says that he is a king, and yet his kingdom is not of this world. His kingdom is not of this world. Look at the befuddlement that you can imagine in your mind's eye, in Pilate's face, trying to understand what that means. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to him whatsoever. What is this claim? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto God what is God's. What? Isn't Caesar a god himself? How are we supposed to reconcile all of this? The truth is, Christianity makes a claim that the truth about God far transcends where you're from, or who you are, the color of your skin, or what's in your proverbial passport. God is God, and He is God for all creation, for all countries, for all peoples. And worshiping Him is not just a matter of being a good citizen. It is something that is your prime objective. It is something foundational. It cuts to the heart of why you exist. This is why Christianity was so threatening in the ancient world. And it's why early Christians were persecuted as people who were claimed to be atheists. It might seem strange that you would accuse people obsessed, on fire, possessed by God to be atheists, yet that is very coherently what they were accused of being. They were denying the existence of all of these cities' gods, of Rome's gods, of Athens' gods. And that just wasn't polite. It wasn't nice. Reasonable people don't do that. You don't challenge. You can have your God, that's fine, but you have to also allow us to have our God. Christianity makes a radical claim. God is God for all. There is one truth. There is one way to worship Him. There is one way to be truly happy. There is one destiny of being united to Him, of having the wounds of sin healed, of having our souls experience His indwelling presence. And yet, because of this, we face a crisis as Christianity gradually becomes the dominant religion in the ancient Roman Empire. Suddenly, the emperor becomes a Christian. And within a few decades, he begins banning, later emperors begin banning the practice of paganism. Well, what do you do now? Now you have this very confusing situation in which a religion which by its very terms defied the constraints of political power, of national or imperial ambitions, and instead kept its eyes focused on the highest things. Now we have political leaders who are Christians and who are trying to navigate these waters of how to be good Christians and political leaders at the same time. This was messy. This is what the Middle Ages in political terms is all about. The coming to terms with this confusing and difficult situation, which we still have with us today. Notice, this is not just a purely historical thing. The challenge of how to be a good Catholic and to be a political leader is not an abstract one. It's not an abstract one. Don't tempt me. Come on, we're staying good. We're being good. We're focused. If we want to put it in terms that I think are more helpful than just thinking about the power of the church versus the power of the state, I think that the big theme that you can take from the early medieval period all the way through the High Middle Ages was that the church was struggling for the freedom to be herself. I use that phrase a lot because it captures the essence of the libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church. This is the classic expression of what it means for the church to be able to fulfill her divinely sanctioned mission, to be a representative of the city of God here on earth, to be God's pilgrim people, to have a life of grace, to be a society that is sufficient in and of itself, and yet one that doesn't preclude belonging to a local community. After all, Christ says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. St. Peter and St. Paul exhort us to pray for the emperor, to be obedient to local authorities. It's not like we're withdrawing from the world, and yet there is an ordering of our allegiances. What did St. Thomas More at the end of the Middle Ages famously say? I am the king's good servant, but God's first. This is a good way of capturing the struggle. How is it that we reconcile these overlapping allegiances? This difficulty of belonging to the city of God, the church, however imperfect, and of at the same time belonging to some outpost of the city of man, if we can use St. Augustine's phrase, belonging to some country or to some society which is messed up, imperfect, but is undoubtedly ours, undoubtedly part and parcel of who we are. The difficulty came with the fact that because the state and political authority so often had notes of the sacred, it seemed like you could just adapt that to a Christian ethos. You could baptize it. We used to worship the emperor. Well, now we won't worship him because that's wrong, but we'll treat him as effectively a demigod. We'll effectively show him incredible reverence. This is the kind of messiness that I was talking about. How is it that you show reverence for authority without basically giving it so much power that they become almost like priests, that they become rivals, as it were, to the church's own internal life, to the church's own dynamic of living and of offering sacrifice to God and of sanctifying the world? This is the difficulty. And so all of the crises of the Middle Ages tend to come down to this. Popes are trying to preserve, in a certain sense, the prerogative of the church to govern her own internal life, to appoint her own bishops, to have religious life, to regulate the offering of the sacraments, the teaching of Christian doctrine, all the different stuff that is the basic unit of Christian life. And on the other side, and I again, calling it sides simplifies, but we've already acknowledged that. We're dealing with that. On the other side, we have the desire for there to be unity in a city, in a state, in a kingdom. That there may be one law, that there may be a kind of fairness because of that, that we wouldn't have separate canon laws for the clergy and civil laws for everybody else. This desire for the local community, say rich landowners, say local political authorities, to have a say in who is their bishop, in who is the abbot of the local monastery, in who appoints the parish priest. I mean, that matters to you all, right? We care about who our parish priest. Go, Father Will. Sorry. I kept threatening I would do that. I didn't think I was actually going to do it, but then I just walked my way into it. Again, this is stuff we care about. Who decides? Who decides? And so all of these controversies throughout the Middle Ages, or many of them at least, are a matter of a tussle forming intellectually, socially, politically, theologically, about understanding how it is that we can love our country, love our community, and love God and His church in ways that don't end up putting them in conflict, or that don't involve subordinating one to the other in a way that ends up corrupting both. Because that's the danger, right? We tend to notice that when ecclesiastical power starts taking control of temporal stuff to such a great degree, it doesn't necessarily have any guarantee that just because you're a priest, you'll be a good manager. Painfully, this is obvious to me now. I don't know why it wasn't obvious to them. Ordination does not confer ability with Excel. It does not give the social gifts of being able to handle employees. I don't know why anyone would want the church to run the economy. Yeah, I know. See, all the priests are nodding vigorously. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yet, the Pope and certain bishops would assert their ability to have temporal power, not so much because they want temporal power in itself, but because if they don't have independence, they're being controlled by somebody else. You see, this is a complicated problem. It's not simply good guy, bad guy, but there's a real difficulty at the heart of it here. If the Pope is under some other sovereign, well, anytime that sovereign doesn't like what the Pope is doing, he'll follow Emperor Henry's footsteps. He'll march right into Rome, send that dude off into exile, appoint an anti-pope. We don't have many anti-popes these days. I think there's a guy in Wyoming, but Pope Michael, I think. Yeah, Pope Michael, yeah. He is. He's a wacko for the radio listeners. Anyway, we've given him too much airtime already. So, I like to think, to summarize this section and to move on, in many ways, we can trace two threads of thought running through this era that continue to shape the way we think about church and state, about religion and politics today. This, again, is an oversimplification. I call them the Eusebian thread, after Eusebius, who is a writer from the early church, and the Augustinian thread, named after St. Augustine. Eusebius famously viewed the empire, the Roman Empire, as the providential tool in the coming about of salvation. Because what does it say in the Gospels? In the reign of Caesar Augustus, the whole world being at peace. This was a providential arranging of things. The empire was the means by which the gospel was spread to the corners of the known world. And so we have a keen appreciation for the fact that Christ became incarnate in a place and in a time, and that this was a graced reality. And so because of that, you tend to view the arrangement of political affairs as reflecting God's providence. And of course, as a good Thomist, I'll absolutely agree with that. But the question is, how far do we want to go in saying that? So we have the Eusebian thread. The Eusebian thread tends to be really positive about the role of the state, of civil power, of temporal power, of monarchs, whatever you want to call it, as part of God's providential plan. Okay. The Augustinian thread tends to want to draw distinctions more. Famous work of St. Augustine, already referenced, The City of God, De Civitate Dei, Against the Pagans, as is the often neglected subtitle. I always like to include that, Against the Pagans. Yeah, take that, pagans. No, on the City of God, on the City of God. Now, in a certain way, well, St. Augustine draws two cities, the city of God and the city of man. The city of God is ultimately what it means to be a true Christian. It is the society of the angels and saints worshiping God. And its representative here on earth is the church. The city of man is, depending upon which section you read, the representation of man's rebellion against God, to try to build up the Tower of Babel, to build up empire and power and self-assertion independent of God's peace, independent of God's good and wise plan. And so you have this constant and perpetual rivalry and antagonism between man's self-assertion, his desire to dominate, to seize power, to take control, against the kind of true peace that comes from being a citizen of the heavenly kingdom, belonging to the city of God. Needless to say, you're going to be a little more skeptical of claims that the empire or the kingdom or the state is God's chosen vehicle when you see, with a certain focus, the ways in which man abuses his power. And we're all too familiar with that. In the end, these two threads, because they're oversimplifications, don't represent a good side or a bad side. They represent currents that are sometimes coming together, sometimes diverging. At different ages, we may need more of one than the other. One may take on too much assertion, too much control. But then at other times, we may need a reminder of that. The Middle Ages were a time of profound faith, where Christianity so permeated many societies that it became the air in which people breathed, the environment in which they lived. And the idea of separating oneself from that environment was almost unthinkable. And yet at the same time, man remains who he is. The lure, the lust for power tends to corrupt, and it tends to cause people to justify unjustifiable things, often in the name of religion. So, how are we supposed to sort this out? This is moving on to my second, and in a certain sense, my main point, which is about the common good. St. Thomas Aquinas, another fat Dominican, another big and tall Dominican, another brilliant Dominican. Yes, thank you. Thank you for those who applauded. And for those of you who didn't, can you hear me? Thank you, yes, raise the roof, as it were. All right. The common good. Doesn't this seem like some kind of leftist front, right? When you hear the common good, that probably doesn't warm your heart, right? You're thinking, great, what is he going to tax now? And that's awful. That's awful. Because in fact, the common good is a way of understanding what we should love and how we should love it. And it must be at the heart of how we navigate all the questions I was outlining at the beginning. What does it mean to say something is a common good? I mean, does that just mean it's common, the way my Southern mother, oh, that's so common, don't do that. That's like telling her that her dress looks fine. Fine is bad, I learned. If I said her hair looked fine, that was the beginning of a rough time. It looks wonderful, incredible, indescribable. Now, we can contrast the common good with an individual good. And it's not to say one is bad, okay, but they're different. A common good is something that we love because it's, to use my philosophical hat, it's metaphysically thicker. It claims us more deeply. It is something more than just what individually satisfies us, but is something in which we participate, something in which we belong. Let me give some examples, because as I found writing to Sina on this, a thesis, when you tend to spend a lot of time writing on the common good, you end up in such abstract philosophical language, you just want to drink, and it's not worth it. So, well, here's what the common good is not, okay? Let's begin with what it's not. That's a good place to start. The common good is not a jar of cookies, okay? Why do I say that? When people think of the common good, they tend to think of, well, we got to distribute something, right? So if we have a big jar of cookies, I have 150 people in the room, me serving the common good is taking the cookies and making sure everybody has a cookie, right? But that's not the common good. All that is taking a pot of things and then distributing it so we each have a little bit. But once I eat the cookie, you cannot enjoy that cookie. I mean, you might love seeing me eat it for reasons that we will probably talk about later. You might love that. You might love that. But you can't enjoy a cookie at the same time and in the same way when I eat it. It's a finite individual good. Ah, there we go. An individual good is some good that once you enjoy it, by its very nature, can't be enjoyed by somebody else. So all of a sudden, a lot of stuff gets excluded. And this isn't just a matter of sharing your individual goods. No, I might share my habit with Father Will, which would be voluminous, majestic, stately. He'd look good in white. I've said that for years. It's very slimming, Will. Maybe not. But the point is, if he's wearing my habit, I can't enjoy it in the same way. And God knows I'm not going to try to put his cassock on. So we're stuck. Individual goods, by their very nature, can't be enjoyed by more than one person at the same time. Here's what a common good is: a family. A family. By its very nature, a family is not just mom, dad, son, daughter, Fido the dog. It's more than the sum of its parts. A family is a thing that comes into existence in which each and every member participates. It's what happens in the sacrament of matrimony. You aren't just sanctifying a couple, you're creating a family. And therefore, what's good for dad and what's good for mom is in no way subtracting from the good of Billy or Sally or Fido. Everybody can participate in that good. And in fact, the only way to love that good is by not viewing it as a zero-sum game, by not thinking of it as inherent competition. When we think of common goods that way, we lose sight of what they really are. But the common good, when loved properly, is an incredible thing that makes you sacrifice, that makes you want to do things for it. Why do people lay down their lives to defend their families? If you think purely on the level of individual goods, that makes no sense. You lose, right? You lose your life. Done. Okay. And no matter how much people might praise you, well, that's not going to give you back your life. And yet, when you love a common good the right way, it is not only heroic, it is the rational thing to do. Because you can only be truly happy when you love the common goods of which you're a part in the right way. That's why we can understand why people lay down their lives for their country, another common good. It makes sense. It's not just something that crazy people do. It's actually a rational, noble, beautiful, good thing to do. Because when you love a common good, you want to give your all for it. Now, you have to do it in the right way and in the right time. Because after all, you also have a family and you have a God. So figuring out how you love these common goods in the right way and in the right relationship is the stuff of politics, is the stuff of our daily lives. Now, there's a few other observations I want to make, and I'll try to power through them. In a certain sense, we love God himself as a common good. You might think, well, that's kind of weird, right? But think about it. When I love God and God loves me, does that diminish in any way your love for him or his love for you? No. God loves us, and we love him as a common good. Satan's rebellion was not just a refusal to love God. Satan is a brilliant angel. Satan refused to love God as a common good. He hated the idea that he would have to love him in a common way with human beings whom he viewed as infinitely beneath him. So yes, failing to love the common good is a demonic thing. It really is. It is the sin of pride. It is the sin of the angels, the fallen angels, that is. When we lose sight of the common good, bad things happen. On a certain level, decadence happens because we lose the ability to invoke sacrifice, to ask people to give generously. Everything becomes transactional. It's bargaining. It's begging and pleading. It's like saying, please, please sign up to serve. Please, please do that. It loses so much. Those of you who may have served in the military, as my father did, will know that the whole thing becomes debased when it just becomes a matter of dollars and cents. It's got to be motivated out of love for one's country. When you lose that, you're not bargaining. You're no longer sharing a common good. Likewise, a family can't just be reduced to satisfying each individual member. It's got to be about a shared love for a good. Now, needless to say, I can and have talked for hours about every possible level of this, right? How is it that we love our country as a common good? How is it that we love our local church, our family? How is it that our friendships, local businesses, all of these things are parts of the common good and are common goods in certain ways? And believe me, it's well worth talking about and thinking about. You should read more St. Thomas Aquinas on the common good. But here's the thing. Because the common good has been so invoked falsely by especially totalitarian regimes and by ideologies, we tend to be afraid of it. And I think understandably so. After living through a century of fascism, of communism, of all sorts of radical ideologies, this claim that you aren't just an individual, but you belong to something bigger, everybody feels nervous, right? That's like, oh gosh, what awful scheme is he trying to involve me in? And this is why it's such a demonic thing, to take those corrupted goods and to use them as a means of abusing a given people. It's why it is that we should have reverence for those in authority, and why it's so awful and evil when those in authority abuse their power. Because it's not just a personal sin, it is a sin against the common good. It's why it's so awful to kill a police officer. You don't just kill someone who is an individual who's worthy of life, you are shooting at authority itself, at the common good of all of us. And likewise, when police officers abuse their power, it's a terrible sin. It's a terrible thing. This is why it matters so much. If we don't show right love for the common good, we aren't able to talk about this. We aren't able to understand why we must love our shared inheritance, why we must love our country, and in the right way. Loving our country as a common good means having a love for her culture, her history, what makes her distinctive, and not just viewing it as a bundle of problems or as a means of power. If we lose the savor for this, we lose something essential in our politics. I do want to say one of my favorite Catholic Thomistic philosophers, Charles de Connick, who wrote a beautiful book about the common good, was giving a speech in the 1950s to a group of businessmen. And de Connick said, you're sitting there very confidently that we are defeating communism, that we are defeating Marxism. And in a certain way we are, but in a terrible way we aren't. Because we're accepting internally in the West an ideology which may not identify itself openly as Marxist, but reduces all relationships to conflict, reduces everything to rivalry, to alternative claims of power. And when you do this, you destroy a society, because every relationship becomes built on lies then. Everything becomes about manipulation. Everything becomes about distorting reality to suit your ideological purposes. This is the sin against the truth that so many ideologies that unfortunately have terrible power today are inflicting upon us. Forcing people to lose sight of what, say, biological sex is a means of distorting reality at the service of an ideology that is a terrible, terrible distortion of the common good and of truth itself. And because we have lost our ability to talk about common goods, we have reduced everything to rival emotional claims. You know, you're hurting my feelings, therefore you're the oppressor, therefore you must be banished from polite society. Needless to say, I could go on at great length, but there is a deep sickness, there is a deep problem. And if we don't recognize it, and if we don't think about it deeply, we'll be stuck in this kind of awful trap. Because as DeConnick noted, the problem with Marxism is it always is parasitical upon some truth, right? The workers really were abused and neglected. Of course, there are awful things. I mean, you can always find some real faults. You can always find terrible things that happen, but how you explain them and how you understand them in the relationship of a common good matters a great deal. All right, I've gone way over what I expected to say. Father Will was totally right. He said, at 1 hour, I'm going to stand up and you better stop talking. And I said, Will, come on. I promise you, 30 minutes, 40 tops. Yeah, 47 minutes in. Okay. You're doing great. You just stay there. It looks like a lovely appetizer. Have a good time. Didn't offer me any, but whatever. That's okay. Sam the man here, generously underwriting a fantastic evening of food and drink, and it's okay. No, I don't need anything. I'll just be hungry. What do we do now? What do we do now? I wish I could talk for an hour about the common good even more, but you get the idea, and we can talk more in Q&A. If it seems vague or nebulous, I'm sorry. I haven't done justice to what is a really important thing. But the basic takeaway truth is this. Unless we love common goods the right way, we'll never be able to advance as a church. We'll never be able to heal the wounds in our families. We'll never be able to build good businesses and strong communities. We'll never be able to have a thriving country. We need to love the common good the right way in order to order these loves and in order to have people love them as their proper good. Because it's not just a matter of giving up your own good for somebody else. It's realizing that I can only be fulfilled, I, Henry Steffen, am only happy when, as the son of Paul and Carol, I'm a good member of my family. When I, as a member of the Order of Preachers, am a good priest and religious. When I, as a citizen of the United States, love and serve my country in the right way. When I, as a member of the city of God, strive to offer my whole self to Him and to sanctify the world with His grace. It's only when I do all of those things in the right way that I can be myself. It's not a matter of losing my individual identity like the totalitarians want you to. It's a matter of being fully yourself and loving your family, your community, your church, your country, God Himself. All right, said that 3 times, but you got the point. What should we do now? Last point, concluding thoughts. Give up. That would be my first advice. Give up. Just give up. Now, I have three bits of advice. This is from a priest, right? So what do I know? Right? Like, why should I give advice to you about politics? It's never a good idea. Never stopped me, though, so might as well. All right, first point. We can't give up, and we can't withdraw. In no way. It is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. Because guess what? You might say, well, listen, things are getting so messy, we're just going to sit over here and we're going to preserve our church. No, because guess what? You are citizens of this country. You are members of this community. You are parts of your family. Unfortunately, just because some common goods might get messed up doesn't absolve you of your duty to serve them as well you can. So we've got to, unfortunately. And believe me, I get deeply depressed reading the news sometimes. And when I say this, I'm not just doing a throwaway line. If you were to really spend time contemplating how messed up our country is, it could drive you to drink more than they have behind that bar there. And yet, to do so is not masochistic. To do so, to love our country and to serve it well, to serve it rightly, is not a matter of just imposing religion. It's not a matter of trying to make it a theocracy. It's a matter of loving America for what she is. For what she is. Just the way we love our families for what they are, even though they can be messed up. Just the way we love our church, even though God knows we've seen plenty of skeletons in that closet. We have got to love the common good, even though it's populated by a bunch of messed up human beings. So we can't withdraw. We can't withdraw. Because even if we somehow manage to delude ourselves that we could be exempted from these laws of politics, from this reality of the common good, the truth is they will come for you. They will come for you. Because the truth is, when you withdraw from political life, when you withdraw from the debates of the age, they don't just say, oh good, we'll leave them alone. Ideological forces press the advantage. They never stop. They never stop. Because they're deluded, but they really do believe they're supporting the good. They're doing it for your good. You need to be converted. Notice it's a quasi-religious zeal with which you will be pursued. And so therefore you can't respond to it with wishful thinking. You have to respond to it with deep faith in God, with deep reverence for Him, and with spiritual lives that are alive with His grace. Okay. Second point. Don't try to blend in. In a real sense, this is what worries me most. So priests, lay people, we all see the situation for what it is. And it is easy to engage in the kind of thinking that if we just act as nice and unobtrusive as possible, they'll kill us last, or they'll get us last. We can't just blend in, because this is the essence of what it means to love the church as the city of God on pilgrimage. Not to think that she's perfect in her human elements, but to recognize she is Christ's mystical body. And because of this, we have to recognize that when we go through a time of purification, it can lead to a crisis of confidence. It has led to a crisis of faith. And yet, if we do not hold fast to the faith, we'll give in to one of two contrary temptations. Either a kind of haughty air of being above these problems, of denying the real difficulties, or this kind of cringing subservience to want to just follow the latest trends, to want to somehow fit in. If you are a real Christian, no one will ever be able to confuse you for being one of the crowd of some of these movements. It just can't work. It can't work. Because in the end, you're always responding to some higher call, which is to be faithful to God, which isn't dependent upon what the trends of the current time are. And so because of that, I really do believe that we can't try to act like the French general in the Revolutionary War who said, there go the people, I must follow them, for I am their leader. You know. We cannot be obsessed with polls. We have to change the polls. You cannot be obsessed with fitting in. You have to love the truth humbly, but confidently, serenely, with real peace of heart and not with anger. And this is a problem that we need to reckon with, the ability of anger to warp and distort our souls. It's easy to get angry. It's not easy to have a peaceful soul that's given over to God. That's what the church is built out of. That's what converts empires. That's what changes reality. So, that's my second point. The third thing is, regardless of whether or not you agree with the first 2 points, I hope you do, but even if you don't, love the common good. Love it better. Love it where you are right now. Teach others to do so by example, not just by being a blowhard talking about it all the time. You have a common good right now that you can love better. Your family, your neighborhood, your community, this awesome parish that hosts great events like this. your workplace, your business, your clubs, the places and institutions you belong to, the Knights of Columbus, God love them. What a tremendous example of the common good. Our relationship with God is deeply personal, but it is never individual. It is never individual. God is a common good, and our souls are shaped to be true worshipers of Him by belonging to these common goods in the right way. Belonging to the Knights, belonging to the Ladies of Charity, belonging to all of the good groups, your family, your business, your community, what have you, running for office, doing the hard volunteer work. All of those ways are shaping your soul to be the kind of person who loves God with His own love. They're shaping your soul to be the kind of citizen who is enlightened by Christ and not just have a soul that's darkened by the ideologies of today. You can do this. It's not your duty to change the world. It is your duty to love whom you have been given in the right way. That may involve sacrifice. In fact, it will involve sacrifice, because every common good means loving something so much that you will sometimes put your individual good at the service of something greater. But you do so not because you just decide to give yourself away in a heroic gesture. You do so because you are rational. You know that when you sacrifice and love for your family, that is not taking away from you, that is making you who you are. When you sacrifice and give for your parish, that does not diminish from your wealth, from your resources. It makes you who you are. When you sacrifice for your country, it does not make you less of an individual. It makes you the kind of man, the kind of woman who can stand up before their grandchildren and say, yes, I have loved my country, however imperfectly, and you love it too. This is the way in which we shape our souls, in which God trains us as citizens of His kingdom. We have got to love the common good well. You can start tonight. You can start with the places, with the people, with the communities that you're a member of. And when you love the common good well, it has a way of changing the world. Thank you very much.